Have you ever wondered how Christian education can shape not just minds, but entire communities and even our culture? In this episode of the Faith Roundtable, me, Josh Burtram, your host here on the Faith Roundtable, I sit down with the brilliant and multifaceted Dr. Jerry Pattengale. He's the director, co-director. Have you ever wondered how Christian education can shape not only just minds, but even our culture at large? Have you ever wondered how Christian education can shape not just minds and hearts, but entire communities and even our culture at large? My name is Josh Burtram. I'm the host of the Faith Roundtable and co-host of the Faithful Politics podcast. And in this episode of the Faith Roundtable, we sit down with the brilliant and multifaceted Dr. Jerry Pattengale. He's the co-director of the Lumen Research Institute and a board member at Christianity Today. He's here to share his insights from his co-authored book, The Habits of Hope: Educational Practices for a Weary World. We're going to dive into the challenges facing higher education today, finances, mission drift, and the pressure to stay relevant. And we're going to explore how Christian institutions can maintain their identity while equipping students to navigate this challenging and rapidly changing world. Jerry's journey from homelessness to leading roles in academia and global initiatives, including the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., is nothing short of inspiring. If you're curious about the intersection of faith, education, and culture, or just looking for some genuine hope in uncertain times, this episode is for you. So, without further ado, let's get started. Hi, my name is Josh Burtram. I'm your host on the Faith Roundtable, your faithful host on the Faithful Politics podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Faith Roundtable, where we interview authors, leading thinkers, writers, and theologians to talk about the issues facing the church today and to see what kind of interesting things and problems and solutions that people are coming up with. And today I get a very special privilege to be able to interview Jerry Pattengale. He serves at Indiana Wesleyan University as a university professor and co-director of the Lumen Research Institute, and as well works with Christianity Today. And we're talking to him about his latest book that he's co-authored called The Habits of Hope: Educational Practices for a Weary World. Jerry, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks for being on here today.
It's great to be here and appreciate these kind of venues. There's a melange of podcasts, right now. And so obviously your staying power represents that you're meeting a need. It's just great to be here. It's an honor. I wish my co-host could be here. We have a lot going on. Todd Ream is probably the most published. One of the co-editors. Todd Ream is the publisher for Christian Scholars Review, and so he is probably the most published in the last 10 years in higher ed in vetted publications, period.
Wow.
And he's at Indiana Wesleyan. We, at Taylor University, another great school, just 15 miles away, hired him away from us, and we hired him back. When the new president came, he said, Jerry, what's the first thing you could do to help education, help, the level of scholarship? I'm blessed to be our first university professor in 120 years. And so I said, well, I'd hire Todd Ream back. And, within 6 months, he was back. And we've done 7 books together ourselves. And the other co-author, before we get into this, is Chris Devers. Chris is a professor at Johns Hopkins University. And we've done, I think, 4 books and 2 or 3 theme monographs with Chris as well. And so we have a melange. We have the behaviorist and the humanities professors working together. And I think that's really the future of higher ed. The longevity it has to have both involved.
Well, that's great. I really appreciate those insights. I can't wait to dig into it. But you had mentioned, the bio was pretty short, the one that I just read. So I'd love for you to give any other insights, anything that you feel like you would want people to know about yourself. We were talking beforehand, before we went live, and you said that you're on the board of Christianity Today. And so would love to know how you got involved there and just kind of give us a sense of what brought you to where you are today.
I'd be glad to. If you go on my LinkedIn, it's probably the best way to catch up with me. I just did a national podcast with what's called Kingdom Flow, two young influencers, yourself, Josh Younger, and very successful financial guy. So I tell the whole story there about coming out of poverty and being homeless and going to Indiana Wesleyan. It offered me a full ride, and so it was a place to live, and ran into a worldview professor and went from there to Wheaton grad school, and then got another undergrad degree, and then two masters in it. Finally, a doctorate. One of the masters at Wheaton, by the way, got a doctorate in ancient Near East from Ed Yamauchi. Dr. Yamauchi is probably the leading ancient historian alive. He's a devout Christian, and he's at Miami of Ohio. So, in a nutshell, that's my journey to this point, and I ended up feeling a call to publish both in the Christian and the secular realms and to be engaged internationally. And, with Christianity Today, I found myself about 15 years ago asked to form another major Bible collection for another major family nationally. I helped the Van Campens initially. You may remember the Scriptorium, the Center for Christian Antiquities. And that melded into the Holy Land Experience down in Florida. Van Campen family is very good to me. We had a wonderful time together. We saw the world. He bought a castle in England. We hosted the British Library. A lot happened in the short. I didn't feel
Wow.
called to stay with that long term, but to help him establish and step aside. And as God would have it, and since this is on faith, I'll tell you what happened. I actually just wrote this a few minutes ago in something that I was publishing.
Nice.
45 minutes after I handed in my resignation at the scriptorium, with no knowledge of what I was going to do, the president of Indiana Wesleyan called me and said, Jerry, been thinking about praying. I think you're supposed to come to Indiana Wesleyan. He had no idea I was
Wow.
going to. And so I was unemployed for 45 minutes. The scriptorium was wonderful. I just felt like it was a dream job. I was sitting at a 20 or 30-foot mahogany table at Hampton Court, Herefordshire in England. And I'm thinking, it was a 183-room crenellated manor estate, a castle. And I was there by myself for a couple of weeks working on some projects for Mr. Van Campen. And I remember thinking, I've got a dream job. And then God kept convicting me, but it's somebody else's dream. And so I had done what I'd promised with Van Campen family, stepped aside, came to Indiana Wesleyan. I hadn't been there really in 20 years. And I spoke in chapel right before that, but that was about it. And so, I had helped build one collection, and many of you have seen it who are listening if you went to the Holy Land Experience. Mr. Van Campen passed away, unfortunately, young, and it was sold to a couple people, and then I think they turned it into a different project altogether. But then about 15 years ago, I get a call out of the blue from the Hobby Lobby family. This is all leading to how I end up at Christianity Today.
It's amazing.
I get a call from the family, to come interview to help them start a museum. They were thinking of starting a museum. So many of you have visited Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. In 2009, it was just a thought, and they thought it might go in Dallas. I turned it down probably 20 times because I simply didn't think I was ready to go back on the road. We were traveling 400, 500,000 miles a year, it feels like. But you know what? After a while, and I'd never met the Green family, I'd never met a member. Barbara Green was on the board at Indiana Wesleyan. Their grandson, Tyler, a wonderful young man, was at our school, found his wife here. And I finally thought, who am I to at least not go and have the conversation? And Josh, I went and all the flight out there, I thought I was simply checking it off and was going to go back. I loved Indiana Wesleyan, loved what I was doing. They made me university professor. So basically I get to write books and go speak and do these things. And, I've done film series. It's a dream job now, but now it's in line with what God's called me to do. Well, what happened was, in a nutshell, is that I'm meeting with Steve Green. There's one other person in the room. And have you ever been in a meeting where about halfway through or sometime the Holy Spirit comes over you and it's like, such a time as this, for such a time as this, I've honed your skills for this. And we shook hands and I made three promises to him. He made three promises to me. One was I'd never have to leave Indiana Wesleyan. And he said, we don't even know if we're going to have a museum. And if we do, we don't know where it's going to be. Well, we ended up choosing DC between Dallas and New York. And obviously we built it. Millions have come. The exhibits there right now are unbelievable. And in that process, I hired a young man you may have heard of, Tim Dalrymple. Tim Dalrymple, if you've not met Tim, and I hope he's listening to this. If not, y'all got to call him. He's not much to look at, but the boy's pretty brilliant. Oh, he's a sharp guy, Josh. You know, he's got degrees from Stanford, Princeton, and Harvard. And he broke his neck as a gymnast at Stanford. He was the all-around gymnastics champ out of high school, and he was headed to the Olympics, more than likely. He broke his neck on the high bar, and I said, how did you handle that? And he goes, well, I got free education out of it. I didn't think it was a bad deal. So for him, you know, and he met, his wife is awesome, Joyce. Well, he started a company called Polymath. They're still in existence. He's since sold it because he eventually then was named the president of Christianity Today. And he turned that down at first. He just said, if you're going to hire someone, you need a storyteller. You need the church story to be told. And he gave an outline how to do it. And God then called him to take on that. And so here's someone I had hired for years, his company, to help with content, to help the Museum of the Bible develop exhibits and develop especially this really robust curriculum. It's a really awesome curriculum. It was a high tech at the time, and now it's going out in a second iteration this spring for public schools. Maybe that's another time to come back on. It's going to be releasing in the fall to public schools. And it's called How the Bible Influenced Western Societies. And so Tim and his group became really the co-author, if you will, with me with this public school curriculum. And we spent hundreds of hours working, on different projects in that one. And then he's called away from that. And I retired from the museum when we opened. I told the Greens I would help it to get till it got open. And then I would step aside, and I did. I think they asked me to stay one more year. And then I left. It opened 2017, left 2018. Well, 2 years later, they asked me to come back and to serve as senior advisor, and Harry Hargrave came back as CEO, and now we have Carlos Campo. And Tim Dalrymple still is engaged off and on with us in some things, but when Tim became president of Christianity Today, it wasn't long after he called me. He says, Jerry, he goes, I'd really love for you to be on the board of CT, and I'm on 5 boards, and I'm on the membership committee at the National Press Club and other things, and I just couldn't not do it. I could not do it. And I'm just about to rotate off. We have one more meeting in London in the spring, and then it'll be my second term. And so that's why I'm on there. And since I'm talking about that, I'll brag a little bit. Josh, everyone listening to this should get the global issue of Christianity Today. The global issue just came out, and there are embedded journalists, I think, in about 40 different places around the world.
Wow.
And those articles are outstanding. I was invited to Seedbed's think tank recently, and one of the things is, what are the best books that you've read recently? Sherry Harder and I were paired up to, that was the question we got. I sent her a whole list. I could only think of a few things right away. And right now I'm reading Malcolm Gladwell's The Revenge of the Tipping Point. Many of you are probably reading that. But I think everything I've read this year, the global issue Christianity Today is the best. And as a Christian, especially those after the political season, there's a lot of back and forth over immigration, over a lot of issues. So it was nice simply to sit down and say, this is not an issue about immigration at all. It's an issue about what are the real daily routines like for Christians in other countries. And what are some of the neat stories coming out of like the trash church in Cairo and the Mennonite farmers? There are Mennonite farmers, an enclave in Siberia. What's happening on Cyprus in a coffee shop where, it's a threat to your life really to have a ministry, and yet it's a thriving. thing. And I'm reading this thinking, I didn't know some of these stories. Like yourself, I travel quite a bit. I assume you know quite a bit about the world. I learned so much. And I felt myself just sitting down thanking God for this issue. I was ordering
Yeah,
copies for other people. I think I had 3 copies from my meetings, gave them all out. So, regardless what else you take from this today, the global issue Christianity Day is, for me, the best read of the year.
that's really cool. Well, I appreciate getting some of that backstory and the context. It's always really cool to hear how people have, stories that have taken them from where they were to where they are, the kind of decisions that they had to make, and context really helps. And so I really appreciate you giving that. You have this new book out, The Habits of Hope, but what motivated you guys to write this book? And how do you envision it kind of addressing the challenges of education that we're facing right now?
Well, it's a very, very fair question, and it's one of a few in a series that Todd and I have done. Just to give Todd, Chris, and I have done, but Todd and I just finished another book called The Anxious Middle. I'd highly recommend that as well. The Anxious Middle looks through Bonhoeffer's lenses, and it looks at 4 main questions. And so we help in that book. We help college boards and educators say, what is it that you're doing in these areas, and what are the historic examples of this? For example, I use Benedict's rule in one chapter. Benedict changed the face of Christianity and all the monasteries with one part of his short rule, and that was once you're assigned to a community, you're assigned for life unless the abbot has a reason to change you. And that regulated monasteries throughout the world. And we look at that and we say, how are our colleges doing that? So that's a historic example where, Bonhoeffer's calling us first and foremost in education. And this carries over in this book. That's why I bring it up. He said, no matter what you're doing in higher ed, as Christians, you should first and foremost be about discipleship. And so we have that, throughout the book. And so when you get into this book early on, you realize that we're kind of reflecting that in Harawas. Harawas was asked in Debating Moral Education, it's a series of essays, like this book is a collection of essays. When Harawas was asked to comment, he said, first, before I go any further, he said, no matter what your Christian schools are doing, he said, you better be about helping them to understand God and his sovereignty before you do anything else. He said, if you're not doing that as a Christian college, you don't have a reason to exist. And then he goes on and, writes his essay. But that's what the problem is today. So when you're asking how it's going to help boards, first and foremost is trying to keep them mission-centric. There's nothing new in that. But what it does is we take some major players and have them speak into this. Phil Ryken sets the stage pretty early in the book on doing that. And so trying to get them to form. Now, I don't stay up late at night, but Josh, I get up early. And for years, one of the first things I would read during the weekday is Inside Higher Ed. I don't know if you read that, but Inside Higher Ed is a free publication, and I started reading it the first day it was sent out. So 25 years ago, probably. Scott Jassick would send it out. He'd left Chronicle Higher Education as its editor. And he started this thing because he saw the future. Now, Scott, I hope you hear this. He's since retired. He has some of his colleagues from those first days still helping. But I remember early in the mornings helping to edit this and send it back to him free. I'd say, hey, you might miss this. And we became good friends. Well, I read it every day because it gives you an update. You know what the lead article is today? The 20 colleges that closed in 2024. I think it's 20. I'd have to look up, see the exact number. And it said 7 or 9 are religiously affiliated. And they're trying to figure out how to survive. And every one of them, the first thing they list, I believe, is finances. So every one of them. And as I was reading through that, I was sending text out. I had to go back on my computer because I thought, man, I'm going to wake people up. I remember sending I may have actually sent a text. Sorry, Dr. Kalaga, if you're listening, the president of Indiana Wesleyan. But what was interesting to me is these colleges that remained open, I mean, there's some of them that remained open. And in Ohio, there's 2 Christian schools or religiously affiliated schools that what they've tried, they're trying to be creative in even staying open. It's uh, um, Findlay and Bluffton, and they're from 2 different denominational traditions. So get this, they're from 2 different denominations. I think they're only 20 miles apart, and they've decided to merge. And from what I can tell, they've decided to merge to stay in their separate athletic conferences. I mean, they're different levels of athletics. They're different denominations. They have different names. They're different cities, and they decided to merge. And I share that, Josh, because this is where we're at in higher ed, because, people want to keep up with their ministry, but the money's simply not there for them to do that. Now, you go back to the book I told you about. Is it because the mission wasn't as solid as before? Each of those schools, you'd have to study each one. And I don't think any of us should stand up and say this school's going woke or that school's lost its mission. I don't like that approach. Eric Metaxas, if you're listening, when I was on your show, Eric, I'll never forget, you said, now, Jerry, could you give us 2 colleges that have gone woke? Josh, he asked me that point blank. He was interviewing me, I think, about the anxious middle. And I said, Eric, I'm not going to do that. But I will tell you, Indiana Wesleyan and Taylor University, side by side, were as solid as you can be. And Taylor's had a rebound financially. They struggled for a while. Indiana Wesleyan is doing really well. We have 15,000 students. Last year, I think we were 20 in revenues over expenses, no debt, 10 or 12 campuses. And so we went through what schools are going through now. We went through that in the early 80s, and we were 1/2 of a year, I think, from going bankrupt and closing. And we had 600 or 900 total students, a campus that was, it was not a when I came here, by the way, in the 70s, I woke up in the morning. Here I was homeless before I came here. I walked outside and looked around, and I go, if I wasn't homeless, I'd leave. It was so ugly. Now I'm not kidding. I mean, you can see, but now it is stunningly beautiful. And so we've been down that dark road. And what we have done since, as Wesleyans, we're still conservative. Our faculty are not allowed to drink even. Not saying that's a biblical maxim at all. It's just they decided in honor of the Wesleyan holiness tradition, spouses and others can, but so it's still conservative. But what we decided to do for the financial side of it is, in times of plenty, to still pinch pennies. So we might commit to giving that overage to deferred maintenance or even creative new projects that are research. I mean, we do that every year. But if there's a program that has no majors, they might let it run 1 year to see if they can rebound. And we even had a Lilly professor. I mean, she literally was a scientist at Lilly. She came to us, Jeannie Argot. Here she was, a researcher at Lilly Labs, and came to us. And she says, I've only got 2 majors in lab sciences. And this is when we were doing very well. I mean, even better than today. And she said, I think I need to close down my major and department. And she did. I mean, I was associate provost back then. And I said, wow, what an honorable thing for someone to do. She was committed to the community. She was committed here for the rest of her tenure. She served it out. And you know what she did? She says, I have one request. She said, I'd like to start on the grounds crew tomorrow. She goes, I've always wanted to take care of flowers. And so for the next 10 or 15 years, that's what she did. And she did it well into her 2 years. She's still alive and doing well. And so it's a much about community and mission, but you have to have the financial things in order. Not enough schools look to the CCCU for help with their finances. There's things you can do collectively. So in the evangelical tradition, there are these 180 or so schools that are affiliated either closely or loosely. And there are some collective things that the CCCU does. Shirley Hoekstra just served out her career heading it up and did a lot in that. And there are also fights that we have we have to fight legally to stay, relevant. Because if the colleges lose their ability to teach what they think is religiously orthodox, if they lose that ability, then you'll see more than 20 schools a year close. And so we almost lost that in recent years in the courts on the pressures to hire people that don't coincide with your religious tradition. And that could be a number of things, but if you don't have the freedom to follow your religious tradition and what you believe the Bible teaches about hires, then we've lost really who we are as a nation. And so that's been the biggest fight over the last several years. I'm sure we're not through it.
Yeah. Dig into that a little bit more. Like, what was that experience like from what you understand of higher education and your experience in there, and why did it create such issues? Like, kind of give me your reasoning behind why, like the statement you made about we're going to kind of lose sight or lose grasp of what it means to be American if we're not letting our schools kind of have those convictions.
Well, we were in, without getting into too much the politics here, but the recent political system, I mean, the country pretty well voted overwhelmingly for one party this time. And I think whether it was in support of a presidential candidate or not, that's a different issue. You can read my writings on that. But what was clear was that there was a pushback on things that seemed to be disconnected from common sense. And one of those would have been the mass immigration. You can read Samuel Huntington's, famous or infamous essay on transitions of people, world migrations and how it changes history when you allow that to happen. But so that's one issue. But another issue obviously had to do over sexual orientation or sexual permissions or sexual rights and gender dystopia and all kinds of things that the research simply was one of the issues involved. But the other issue was, the Bible's pretty clear on its, Romans 1 and other places. The Bible's pretty clear on some of these topics. And if you don't believe, if you have your own interpretation, or if you have a totally progressive view somehow, and you want to eisegetically have some other view of that, you're welcome to do that. Just go to a different denomination or go outside the CCCU schools. So again, I can't talk for Catholic schools, which are pretty conservative as well. I can't talk for Mormon schools, but I can talk for the evangelical Protestant schools. There's a pretty solid belief that, you are not going to be endorsing same-sex marriages. Calvin College, it played out with Calvin, and they really still are going through that whole struggle of what do you do when you have a rare document that is one that you're allowed to struggle with certain positions, and then you have a whole bunch of faculty that use that for their positions. These are good men and women. I mean, some great scholars. And all of a sudden, you're going to have issues because your conservative base or your orthodox base is not going to tolerate that long term. If there is an endorsement of that, then you will lose your way in the CCCU, because I'm sure that the CCCU would not allow Calvin College to stay in had they not addressed that, because it simply was not in line with their orthodox view. And so those are the issues. And then some of the legislation pending in Congress, it was so acute that you had professors that were trying to figure out what is the best way to go forward. If that bill passes and we're not involved, then we're done. So if we get involved, maybe we can put a provision in that helps religious schools. And so without confusing the audience and all the names of bills and everything, and quite frankly, I'd have to get my list out. That's what happened about 6 years ago. Some of the Christian presidents were saying we have to brace ourselves because we have a political wave of people that are pushing for these federal bills. And if they pass and we're not cooperative, we have no right to exist. And so we at least need to be bipartisan in how we look at this and try to at least save the Christian schools, even though we disagree with the bill. So that's what was going on, Josh. And a lot of college presidents either lost their jobs over this because their base rose up and said, he or she is liberal. What are they doing? What are they doing cooperating with these politicians? And what these college presidents, good men and women, what they were trying to do was to save their school down the road because they were going to be totally on the outside. If everyone could interview one person Joanne Lyons. So Joanne Lyons, she started Limbs for Hope and other things. She was the first woman superintendent of the Wesleyan Church, of the Wesleyan denomination. So the Wesleyan denomination, I think, has 5 schools. Indiana Wesleyan is the flagship, and then you have Houghton College. The other schools have Wesleyan in their name. They're not Wesleyan. There's only 5 denominational schools. Joanne Lyon told me, she's been in the White House dozens of times. She's been on many, many commissions and committees. And she said, Jerry, she said, I serve Christ first. And she said, no matter who's president or vice president, when I'm asked for opinions and to serve, I do that as a Christian. And I said, I can't be too aligned with a political party one way or another. I can't be critical to the point of just trying to dismantle them. You know, Charlie Kirk, for example, has this calling, I'm sure, but Charlie Kirk would have a hard time ever really helping a Democrat leader. And
yeah,
so we have to say, you know, I serve a Christianity Day's board. You know, we have people on both sides of the aisle. You know, I'm conservative, you know.
Of course.
I voted Republican. I have articles about it, you know, read my M&M piece. He had some pretty faulty logic I wrote about. I've got a piece coming out called The Orange Elephant, you know, and, you know, trying to reflect on all this. But, you know, another member of the board was one of the faces for Harris, one of the evangelical faces for Harris. So I'm sitting on a board where you've got both parties represented on the board, and I can tell you that person, he's a godly man. I love the guy. He's on all kinds of boards. But when it came, and there was a reason for him to align with that particular position and party. Now, would he support some of these bills coming out? I doubt it very much. I mean, I really haven't talked to him about it. I doubt it. But for him, you know, the passages in the Bible on love and helping the poor and so forth, I'm sure drove that alignment. And so that's one of the huge battles for Christian schools is when they're trying to help, their irenic spirit is sometimes mistaken for compromise. And that's just not the case. Let me give you one example, too, of how hard this situation is. We only have an hour. Wow. You know, I thought, well, you know, sometimes that can seem long, but
it's all good.
Yeah. So I was interim president for Religion News Service. So had a wonderful year. Now they have a president now, publisher, and they have a wonderful editor in Paul. Bob Smetana. Some of you may know Bob. He used to be at Christianity Day briefly. Bob's a good friend. But I got calls from them. They said, Jerry, you know what's happening at Taylor? And I said, no. They said, can you get over there? And I said, sure, because I'd stepped off at that point, and I write for them occasionally. Mike Pence was speaking at commencement. Do you remember this whole ordeal? So Mike Pence was asked to speak at commencement, and this was around I think it was around 2016. And one of his best friends is one of my best friends, which I didn't know, really. He never really talked about it, Bright, never really said much until all this happened. And I ran over there and sat in the graduation. I was actually got an invitation, so I do a lot with Taylor University. And they have Michael Lindsay there now, so many of you know Michael. So I'm sitting there, and it was a phenomenal speech. I mean, his examples of people sitting in the crowd. I mean, Vice President Pence was very prepared, very professional, very humble. There really wasn't any real mass exodus, anything like that, like everyone thought there was going to be. There was one professor that put a magazine in front of her face. I don't think she's there any longer. But anyway, it just wasn't, by the way, maybe a 2020 election, but it just wasn't the big deal that everyone thought it was going to be. Because what happened was some alumni that were in more liberal groups had found out Pence was invited and started this massive campaign nationally against Taylor University. Mike Pence is a good man. Mike is a very good man, regardless of your politics. Now, some people love him because of January 6th. Some people hate him because of January 6th. I can just tell you personally, he's a good man. I say the same about Sally Quinn, who's friends with the Biden, very good friends with the Biden. Sally is a good woman. I mean, she's a friend. I mean, and we need to treat people civilly. Well, I remember sitting there and seeing the backlash of what happened. And the president of Taylor University ended up resigning over it. Lowell he's a great guy, former lawyer, formerly was VP of student development there years earlier. But he resigned over it. It was so much pressure on him for bringing Mike Pence to that campus. And I thought, wow. And what happened was Taylor University took a hit. It caused them serious enrollment issues because suddenly you have a school that's the darling child of parachurch organizations, Wandering Wills, you have former parachurch presidents as president. Gene Habecker was a mainstay there. I mean, just some neat stories at Taylor. It's one of the oldest schools, too, in the Midwest, religious schools. It's a great school. And suddenly there were parents questioning whether or not it was orthodox because of the backlash against Mike Pence. And so as we write these books and do the research, you have to somehow walk the line between the pedantic of being too pedantic and being too given to populism. I mean, there's two forces coming at us. You have the ivory tower approach, Josh, and then you have the populist approach where just because people are marching by the tens of thousands doesn't mean they're right. It
totally
means there's a lot of them, and it means you better pay attention or you may be voted out of office, which is what happened. So somehow we need to be able to walk both aisles. Let me revisit one thing I said here. Sally Quinn ran the On Faith section of Washington Post. I wish I could show you a picture here, sitting with Sally at the famous tavern at the restaurant near her house in Georgetown. It's actually got the plaque of her name on the plaque. She's pretty well known. Sally was talking with me about the Biden family. This is right after President Biden was elected. I walked away from there thinking, I believe her. I believe that family is a good family. I believe that generally he's a good guy. I don't agree with a lot of his politics or his political decisions, but I left there feeling encouraged. She sent me her book, asked me to review it. She, came to my book launch and a movie series. And I just think that as Christians, first of all, we need to involve Christians of a lot of different pathways that I would say orthodox, but you want them a lot of different pathways if you can. And that's what we do with this book. And also need to be respectful and somehow, still endorse the law of non-contradiction, but have an ironic spirit. And so that's what we've tried to do.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Part of what you try to talk about is hope, and that's in the title. It's something that all of us need, especially giving some of the context of how tough it's been in higher education. The politics affect higher education, right? It's supposed to be a place where you're developing critical thinking skills, where you're learning how to, let essentially, you're supposed to let different viewpoints come in and challenge you and all of that. I mean, that's kind of part of the point. And yet there's the tension of trying to maintain your tradition, trying to maintain your base, essentially what they believe, and some of the ways that you get money. You have to have people send their kids to the higher education, which means that you have to maintain a certain reputation, it seems like, or at least be aware of that and balancing that, right? That's tough. And it's a tough thing to have hope when it feels like there's a lot of hopelessness and all the complexity. How do you define Christian hope within the context of education? Why do you think it's so essential?
Well, I was anticipating that. So I pulled this up from Father Kevin Grove and The Cross, Our Hope. A lot of people think he might be the next president of a very prominent Catholic school. I'll just leave it at that. If you'll indulge me just for a moment, because it's better than what I can say. I mean, anyone listening to this should ask Father Grove to come to their campus and speak. He is that solid. He's a young man too, he's your age. Because the challenge of naming the hope of education is not to settle for a hope that is too small or proximate. However worthy such desired hopes might be, the hopes of a degree, a career, great research, or even more humane and just societies are resplendent hopes in themselves that education does and should serve. These hopes are proximate compared with the great hope, life eternal with God. This chapter, and he goes on to write about it, suggests that for education, the Christian habit of hope gives fundamental depth to the basic human desire for transcendence. Christians' education's preoccupation with a great hope for life eternal that we might share is not an afterthought, but a teleological grounding that can give life and light to the classroom, the laboratory, and the institutional mission. And this is the challenge for the Christian Research University in our time, to articulate and abide a vision of Christian hope, true to the Gospels, that does not close down inquiry, but enlivens it among all that deserve all of the diverse participants in the institution's mission. And so what he's saying is, we shouldn't shy away from the theological discussions that we have of the eternal. And we found that as well, by the way, at the Museum of the Bible, where people were coming through and they loved the ancient history that was being represented. But one of the key funders, the Holiday Inn family, the Jack and Betty Moore, said, we think it's Jesus light. And what they were saying is the same thing really as Father Grove. They were saying that people need to come through and realize the Bible talks about an expectancy beyond this world that's greater than ourselves, that there is something that can be motivating and aspirational about God and God's message himself. And that led to a major funded project called The Road to Emmaus. And you actually leave there talking about Christ's return. It's pretty special. And so that's what he's talking about here, not shying away, from the spiritual. Todd Ream and I were talking yesterday, knowing this is coming up. And Todd and I were looking at the distribution of majors at our campus and how this plays out at other campuses. In fact, if you want to get a pretty good list of this, the CCCU can give it to you for the Christian schools. When we launched the book launch for this book, again, if you go to my LinkedIn, it talks all about that book launch. You see a picture of 200 people in the room. Half the group were Catholic schools from Indiana, and half the people there were from Protestant schools. We intentionally brought the two together so that we could talk about this. And here's what we had in common, Josh. Not our liturgy, not all of our theology, but really our orthodoxy. Some people would say, well, that's not quite true between the two, but the more you hang around your Catholic friends, the more you realize they believe in Christ the same as you do. Yeah. And so we were looking at what holds us together. And he said, what's tough, when you start looking at the number of majors on these campuses, the humanities has been cut back so severely for practicality reasons. They're saying, well, you have nursing majors. Well, if you have nursing majors that don't understand ethics, if you have doctors or lawyers that don't understand ethics, it might as well go to Canada to their law schools that won't let you use the Bible at all. You remember they voted down the Christian school in Canada trying to launch a law school. And so what's happened is there are shrinking majors that are needed because that's where the main teachings, these biblical teachings that Father Grove is talking about, manifest themselves in these community questions. There's a group. And Darren Campbell, he's a IW grad, actually. He started the big company called Slingshot. They deliver books across campuses, dozens and dozens of campuses, been very successful. But he also started Campus EDU. And what he does is he's trying to give alternate ways to deliver. Now, whether you agree with that or not, or whether it's competition for your school or not, that's a different question. But what Darren can do is he can look under the hood of all the colleges he's servicing. And he told me one day, he said, Jerry, he goes, the issue that we're facing is that there aren't students in those majors, because he can see the book orders. He has the actual data that can tell you how many students are signing up for political science in a school, or how many students are signing up for an ethics class, how many students are taking any Greek or Latin or Hebrew for religion. And he said, it's not a pretty picture. And actually, I texted him probably at 5:30 this morning. And I said, Darren, what you told me, I think 12 years ago at a conference, and I wrote about it later in Christian Scholars Review. You can find my post there. It's about the Chicken University. It was kind of a parody he wrote. He said, he said 10 or 12 years ago, he said, Jerry, he said, based on what I'm seeing in these majors, based on what I'm seeing in the trends, there's going to be at least 50 or 60 colleges closed in the next 15 to 20 years. And I wrote him
Man.
today when I saw that article, and I said, Josh, I talked about earlier, I said, Darren, I didn't know if I really believed you back then. I knew that you had data that might happen, but I said, the problem is your estimate was low. It was too low. And so you have to have students that with their parents, they're saying, regardless of the cost, it's the cost of discipleship, if you will, a kind of a double entendre there. But that's really where it's at. You have to be willing to pay, because you're going to get that. And if you're not getting those humanities questions when you go to a private school, then I'm not sure why you would go.
Yeah, those seem to be a fairly integral part of what a Christian education is kind of meant to be. A Christian higher education, what is that? What's the philosophy behind that? What's the mission behind that? And, you talk about educational practices, integration, conversation, diversity, reading, writing, and teaching. What kind of give me the sense of what is Christian higher education? What's its purpose? Why is it integral to keep going? And I heard you talk about kind of the discipleship, why would a parent want to pay that money to have their child go, and kind of make that case for it, and then how these educational practices, how they can be used to really shape the character and soul and self of the people that are going to the institutions.
That's a great question. And I would say, by the way, in the book, Phil Ryken talks directly on this, on the integration question. So president of Wheaton College. So for those that get the book, by the way, many colleges ordered it for their boards and so forth. So a lot of people are doing that. But I would share this. And if you go to Religion News Service, I have an article there about January 6th where I quote this professor at a Christian school whom I had, Dr. Glenn Martin, at Indiana Wesleyan. Here's the essence of Christian higher ed, is that if you're a Christian and you believe that the ultimate question is theological, then why would you not want to learn where your theology, where your learning is underpinned? Learning, the word educate comes from the Latin. There's two forms of it. It means to pull out, if you will, or to learn. And if you're not going to be pulling out through the lenses of theology and trying to figure out how all of that relates to the question of theology, then you're not maximizing that learning experience in my mind. He said, and I was a new Christian for about a month when I sat in his class. And he said, remember this, my friends, and never forget it. Am I who I am because of who God is, or is God who he is because of who I am? He said, life's ultimate question is one of theology. And I was sitting there as a new Christian going, well, no one's ever asked that of me before. Well, how do I know who God is? How do I get to know him better? You can spend the rest of your life doing that, and it has to do with which books that they're requiring you to read. It has them to do with what questions they're asking you in your classes. It's also, and you can do this online now in communities and everything, but also has to do with the interaction with colleagues. And you want a seasoned veteran in these practices to mentor this. But then he said this, and this all the rest of your classes. He also said, but remember, he goes, in order to understand more fully and answer the theological question, he goes, there's 4 philosophical questions of ontology, epistemology, axiology, and teleology. And in a nutshell, how do we know where we're going if we don't know where we are? And how do we know where we are if we don't know where we've come from? And so what he allowed me to do is he allowed me to have a structure. And you can get his book, you can look it up, Dr. Glenn Martin. There's, Francis Schaeffer does a lot of this, but he was actually pre-Schaeffer. He taught at Wheaton, and then he came down here to Indiana Wesleyan. But basically, he said, every time you read a magazine, every time you listen to a newscaster's show, you should be able to filter that through what you've learned in these classrooms. you should, in a sense, have an outline. Philosophically, where's that magazine coming from? If you're reading an Atlantic piece, is there an underpinning bias or not of that writer, not of the magazine overall? By the way, I read Atlantic pretty faithfully, The Economist pretty faithfully. But what is their philosophy of how we learn? What is their philosophy of how you know where society's headed? Is there an overarching philosophy at all for some of these people? And then the other thing that all colleges should do, especially Christian colleges, we should follow Abelard. Abelard really started the liberal arts. And so you have a wonderful leader of the church, and he would put, I don't know if you've ever heard of sic et non, but it's a yes and no. And he would put scripture in the middle of a page, so to speak, and then he would basically say, here's what one religious leader said about it on one side and one on the other. And what he's calling you for is, how do you process new information? And as Christians, in this integration of faith and learning, we're saying, if this is true, then how does that apply to us, for example, in loving the poor? I talked about my friend who is a face for Harris. I mean, for him, he would interpret that and say, we should love the poor and we should aggressively do this. And he would line up and he would understand that more fully. And I believe the same. We might operationalize that differently, but we understand why we're operationalizing it. But in order to do all that, Josh, what the Christians had been strongest with, and most of the clerics of the courts early on were priests that had gone to the cathedral schools, is the law of non-contradiction. Two opposing things cannot be both true in the same time in the same respect. And what happened recently in history, and especially in the United States, is you had politicians standing up, arguing about social issues, and they would use the same scenario. And one would say that this is true, and one would say it's not. And so as Christians, you need to understand how to process basic information, and then you need to understand how to place that into a framework that's theologically sound and that is philosophically astute. And it's hard. It takes time to do that. You know, in the Middle Ages, the queen of the sciences was theology. And so they didn't even want you to study theology until you were a learned individual, because they thought it was that important and that hard. The queen, I mean, that's what you prepared to study. And if you couldn't master some of the lower level, which we don't see them that today in the trivium, but then you couldn't even study theology. So that was my first lecture. You know, they're talking about theology, and I didn't even know what it was. And I could, and so we have to take these students from all different levels. And there's one question you didn't ask: what about integration of faith and learning by denominational specific schools? For example, should a Reformed student go to Reformed school? That's going to be a good question. Calvin College exists because a lot of their students go to catechism schools or Reformed schools, K through 12. And it's just a natural graduation to that. And I think that they leave school, if they go through that whole program, the rest of their lives, they at least have a framework. They can go into grad school and other places, and like I did, go get a state school degree after Christian school. I mean, but there's merit in that as well. And so I don't think people should shy away from that either.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. This is my last question before just some practical questions. What makes you hopeful about the future of Christian education, and what are you most concerned with right now?
Well, I think that with what happened in the backlash against, just one example, when you're asking what hopeful for Christian education, the backlash against states and particular politicians allowing the mutilation of children, the lack of a moral code. People go to the church for that. And not all Christian churches, but there is a common morality in some issues. But on that one there, the hope for Christian school is, I think people retreating from the baseness with which they have seen lately. And when we were writing the book, we didn't know this was going to actually be so acute right now. And, I heard Corrie ten Boom, in one of her last talks, she said, when we cease to be shocked by sin, we lose hope. And our society is still being shocked by sin. And I pray that that never ends. And as long as that happens, people are looking for controlled environments and for leaders. Also, I would answer it this way, Josh. C.S. Lewis talks about an oughtness. Every human being has an oughtness. And you can't really put your finger on it. You just know there's something beyond yourself. And I think whatever we do to heighten that reality, and one of the movements that's happening, I've been fortunate to work a lot with Christian musicians. Have you been to some of their concerts, Josh? My goodness. There are tens of thousands. I was with Dylan Thomas recently from Hillsong United. He helped at the museum with our All Creation Sings event. Dylan played in front of 250,000 people at one time. And so when you have those audiences, I think we have a situation where a lot of the hope of the Christian college is in aligning with the music of the millennials and the Gen Zers and others, because what they're doing is they're pointing these crowds, these millions of people, they're pointing them to something beyond themselves. And the music is no longer a simple chorus. It's a blessing, or it's a Honey in the Rock. I was privileged to interview Brooke Ligertwood and Brandon Lake recently. And it's just powerful. I met Jake. I don't know if you know the group Jake. Now, they don't necessarily do Christian songs, but they're Christians in the environment of pointing to beauty and love. And their Golden Hour song, which they wrote in the bedroom of their parents' parsonage while they're teenagers, had 1.2 billion downloads. I don't know what it is now. And so is there hope for Christian school? I think that I see this movement, whether it's the convergent worship through Constance Cherry and others, or whether it's Elevation, or I was with Shane and Shane recently, whether it's them or the Gettys, met with him, Nashville event not too long ago. I think there's hope, because I think there are masses of people that are coming up from the youth that are looking for something beyond themselves, and they know that that's Jesus.
I love that. That's so good. I appreciate your words so much, Jerry, and all your wisdom that you've been able to share with us over these past 60 minutes. Thank you so much for coming on the show. How can people follow your work? What do you have going on? How can they connect with what you're doing?
Well, thanks for that question. Yeah, LinkedIn, I got off social media, I had a top 10 website in 97, something we did. And because of the families I worked with, I've stayed off of social media for the most part for almost 20 years. And my publishers just wanted me to get back on. But if you go on Amazon, you'll find a lot of my books. And we've had several. The new book of Christian Martyrs is also out recently. Museum of the Bible, you can see my stuff there. I have a site on Livestreams Network as well. So that's probably the best way to see it. If you go on LinkedIn, you'll find things I'm doing. Lumen Research Institute, my bio is on that at Indiana Wesleyan. Yeah, I don't do a comedy tour or anything like that, so I can't list all those things here. But I have a Christmas series coming out, by the way. It's 6 straight days, Christmas articles. I'll try to get permission to repost those on LinkedIn. They've been doing it for 20 years or so, where it's like the Holiday Inn ads. They're full color pages related to true stories of growing up in Buck Creek, Indiana, and I'm just privileged to share those. So those are probably the best ways to find. I will give one other thing. I did a series called Inexplicable: How Christianity Spread to the Ends of the Earth. So you can get that free online. Kingdom Flow is the most recent podcast I did. It aired yesterday, I think, and it challenged all of you to go there. 2 young entrepreneurs run that. So those are probably some of the ways. Heroes of the Faith is another 1-hour series. That's on the Martyrs book that just came out with TBN with Eric Stackelbeck. And Encounters is a series by Olive Tree Media that just released. Actually, they filmed it right here in this chicken coop.
That's great.
This is my writing office. They came all the way here from Australia and interviewed me here and Carlos Campo. But it's Encounters, and it's a really neat series of testimonies, regardless of what you think of mine. But so those are some places, Josh. And then here.
That's great.
Hopefully people listen to this.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we appreciate it so much. And we'll have to have you come on again to talk about some of these other things at the Museum of the Bible and some of your other experiences. That would be really cool.
Okay, if you ever see a picture of my family, you look like my brother Vincent. You
nice.
Look very similar to him. He's a lot smarter than I, so take that as a compliment as well.
That's funny. No, I appreciate it. I appreciate it a lot. Well, to our audience, thank you so much for joining us, guys. Make sure that you like and subscribe. Share this with someone that you think needs to hear this content. We appreciate you doing that so we can keep bringing you this great stuff, these great interviews, and this thought-provoking material. And until next time, guys, thank you so much for joining, and take care.